Hi everyone, Keith St. John here. I post in the subreddit for composting quite a bit, and people asked me to do a video on my system, a little more detailed than the one that I did last night. So I'm going to do a real basics on how to compost, why you should compost. One of the biggest things that we can do while we're here on this planet is reduce our carbon footprint, to live sustainably, and to build soil. Our soil is depleting into our oceans and rivers, is one of the fastest commodities that we're losing on the planet. And if we can rebuild some of that by taking waste streams, then we should all try to do that. When we put compost in a government compost system, typically what they'll do is they'll just send it all and put it in a big pile. When things are in a giant pile and they're just left to sit there, there's not enough oxygen that gets to it. And when it breaks down and decomposes, you have a whole bunch of methane forming instead of CO2. CO2 is a greenhouse gas, but this stuff, when it sits anywhere in a landfill or anything like that, it'll decompose at the very least to CO2. But what usually happens is there's oxygen depleted zones, and it depletes to methane. And methane is 30 times worse of a greenhouse gas than CO2 is. So composting is really simple. Nature does it for you. You can't mess it up. The worst thing that you can mess up is let it rot by not having enough browns. And so I'm going to teach you the few tricks to composting. It's super simple. I find sometimes when you read it, it's not as obvious to what you should be doing, but when you watch someone do it, it makes it really easy. So what I do is I have kitchen scraps. I put kitchen scraps in one of those bins. I'll just start from the back end because you'll understand why in a second. So I run my compost system on swales. You don't have to. You can have it in a corner of your backyard. You can have it between two houses. If you do it right, it's not going to smell. It's going to be totally odorless. And the trick to that is having enough browns. So sometimes in composting they talk about greens and browns. So what does that mean? Greens is nitrogen heavy stuff and browns is carbon heavy stuff. So greens is leafy stuff, grass clippings, coffee grinds have a lot of green in it, you know, green, nitrogen. Brown stuff is sticks, twigs, cardboard, newspaper, straw. When you cut grass and it slowly turns brown, what actually matters is the time that you cut it. So when you cut it, if it was green, it's mostly green, even if the next day it's brown. As time goes by, it will turn more green to more brown. So maybe a month later, that grass is mostly green, or mostly brown, sorry. Your goal is, in your compost, to have it about 75% by volume brown, actually. And most people mess up with their composting by having their compost mostly green. Typically people will just throw a whole bunch of kitchen scraps in a compost bin, and it won't look like this. It won't look like a bunch of leaves in there. It'll just look like a bunch of rotting garbage. Now I'm putting my hand in there. It doesn't smell. Nothing in there smells right now. And my finished compost pile, which I'll take you to afterwards, it doesn't smell. It's completely odorless. So what I do is I'll just tip my kitchen scraps. And then I have leaf bags. So I go and I pick up people's leaf bags all the time. And I'll just fill this thing back up. Once with leaves, and I'll dump it in, and I'll fill it up again with about the same amount of leaves, dump it in. So right now, that was 2 buckets of leaves for 1 bucket of compost by volume. And then what I do is I fill up my bin about 1/4 full with leaves. So that means that this bin was actually not a full bin of greens. It was about 75%, so 3/4. So what I put in was 2 1/4 of leaves and 1/4 or 3/4 of green nitrogen. That's approximately the right balance for a compost pile. And then all you have to do is observe, look at your compost pile. And I'll show you that in a second with a more finished pile. So we're on my upper swale system. I have a video on it that I posted yesterday. This is a finished compost pile, so I put it up here to finish. What finishing means is I have a lot of wild animals around, like by design. I would have them anyways, but I like to invite them in as well. And when I run my compost pile, if I just put a bunch of food out here, you know, I'd have raccoons and whatever, everything in that compost. So what I do is first I run them inside the bins, the black bins. That does two things. It gives some time for these things to break down a little bit. And then it also acts as a black material item to attract the sunlight, to heat it up and help get that compost process started. So compost is all going to be bacterial driven in a hot compost pile. In a cold compost pile, it'll be largely worm driven. I want to start it with heavy bacterial driven compost because that will actually turn around the fastest. And the two ways that I keep it going fast is maintaining a good ratio. Actually, 3 ways: maintaining a good ratio, keeping it damp, not moist, not dry, but damp. It should be like if you took a sponge and wrung it in your hand, 1 drip would come out. So just kind of like a moist sponge. And then well oxygenated. The oxygen, just like in a fire, in a fireplace, the oxygen is the driving force for the fire, and then the nitrogen is the fuel. So if you don't have enough nitrogen, it's going to stop and it's going to look really dry. Even if you wet it, it's going to look dead. If you don't have enough browns, it's going to get slimy and wet, and it's going to stop as well because that's a slower process. So if you don't have enough browns, it's going to smell, it's going to be slimy and wet. And if you've just started out and you're just sticking a bunch of kitchen scraps in a compost, that's probably what yours looks like right now. So you need more browns. Leaves, cardboard, shredded newspaper. Avoid the glossy stuff with the print. You don't want any waxy print stuff. Avoid tape and stickers and that sort of stuff. So pull that off first, but just, you know, black and white newspaper is fine. That stuff's all soy-based ink. That's okay. Typical packing boxes. So I'm going to turn this now. I got a car coming. So the audio might go. I'm going to turn this now and I'm going to kind of show you how you get. That's it. It's simple. So what I actually do to get a good flow of oxygen, you can see the heat coming out of there, and it's freezing right now. It's really cold. All biological processes stop and slow down in the cold. So this thing, when it was snowing and I had a foot of snow outside, no snow was on this. It'll keep going. When it gets to -40, it's going to slow down and stop. However, your goal in turning this is that you're trying to get the middle and bottom of the pile back to the outside, and you're trying to get the outside of the pile back to the inside. So what I typically do is I'll turn it across the hill. So let me show you that. Okay, so here's my compost pile. Here's the swale. So the swale is a trench on contour, I mentioned this before, where you dig it out and you put all the soil on the downhill side. I filled it with leaves for now, so this is actually about 2 feet deep, about 4 feet wide. I like them actually a little shallower and wider. This was my first one. But I filled it with leaves for now because I wanted to protect the roots of the trees that are growing in this swale here. But I run the compost pile just uphill of the trench, and I'll turn it down on contour. I'll turn it down. And when I'm turning it, what I'm really trying to do is get the outsides of the pile, get that outside, and put it down as the new bottom center, and both outsides. And then I want the middle back on top. And what that's going to do is the composting happens at the soil compost interface, And that's where all the microbiology and the action is. Because just like, you know, if you make soup and you're going to can soup, you want to keep soup through the dangerous bacterial range really fast. So between 40 and 150 Fahrenheit, that's where you get a lot of bacterial multiplication, like very, very, very fast, where you can get thousands and hundreds of thousands of generations of bacteria in a short amount of time. So you want to boil your soup really hot, and then you want to try to cool it down through that range of 150 to 40 Fahrenheit as fast as possible. For me, when I'm doing my compost, I actually want to do the opposite. I want to keep it in that range as much as possible. If I go... So when I'm doing my composting, I actually want to do the opposite. I want to keep it within the 140 Fahrenheit to 40 Fahrenheit range as much as possible. Too hot, too warm, and the soil microbiology will actually die, that I depend on, and too cold, and they just don't multiply readily. So you really want it in that range for as long as possible. If it gets colder than that, it will still decompose. It's just going to do it mostly by worms and larger macro soil biology, so nematodes, arthropods, all the bigger things. If you get it warm in the 150 range, it's mostly going to be bacterial driven decomposition. Now, that's perfect for gardens, because most of the stuff we grow in a typical kitchen garden actually wants a bacterial-dominated soil, and I'll talk about that in a future video, setting your soil up for the systems that you want to make, whether it's fungal-dominated or bacterial-dominated. But for now, if you're putting compost in your garden, you're doing the right thing, because you're growing tomatoes and lettuce and all that sort of green leafy stuff in bacterial-dominated soil, so that's what you want. Now, there's good guy bacteria and there's bad guy bacteria. The good guy is aerobic, and they love oxygen. They thrive in the presence of oxygen. The bad guys are anaerobic, and they thrive in the absence of oxygen. Those typically tend to be more of your predatory, negative impacting bacteria for your plants and your root system, so you want to avoid those if possible. What I'm showing you behind here is I have a rain catchment pond here. It's not big, it's just a small little pond, but my roof water is diverted into this pond, and I run fish and frogs in this pond in the summertime. When this pond overflows, it overflows down into my swale, and then that fertilizes and irrigates my fruit trees that are on that swale. I run this first set of compost here. So these are the block bins that I was talking about, and when I'm putting water into the compost in order to keep it, remember, kind of damp, like a sponge where you squeeze it, one drop comes out, why not use a nitrogen nutrient rich water that you would get from water in a pond that frogs and fish are living in? So it's perfect, and that'll just fill back up. You know, in a tiny little rainfall, that'll fill right back up for me. So you want three things. You want a good mix. That is 75% by weight, or by volume, sorry. 75% by volume browns. You want water and you want air. Those are the three things. It's really not that hard. You just turn your pile. If it's looking dry, you wet it. If it's not looking dry, you just turn it. And you just make sure that every single time you add your kitchen scraps, that you're adding lots of browns. So in the fall, when the leaves are falling, go grab a bunch of people's leaves that they're throwing away all their fertility, bring it to your compost piles. That way you have tons of browns. Go around with your truck and load up on cardboard when people throw cardboard out in recycling days. Save your cardboard. Your egg cartons are great. Newspapers are great. If you can keep it off a giant diesel truck that's, you know, even though you're recycling, that thing's carting and driving all around the city carrying all this kind of recycling, if you can keep that off our streets to the amount possible and use it in your compost and turn it into beautiful soil, that's really what you want to do. And that's how we can kind of all do small little steps to save the planet and leave a legacy behind, permaculture legacy. Alright, thanks for watching. I hope you understand a little bit more about composting. And remember, you can't mess this stuff up. It's not that hard. If you mess it up and you do everything wrong, as long as you're not using meat, you're not using fats, everything will decompose. If you use meat and fats, you might get mice, and if you use fats, it's just going to sit around and do nothing. You can deal with that in different other systems. There's things like black soldier fly larvae, which I might do a separate video on down the road. You can run stuff in vermicompost bins, which are worm bins, and you can do anaerobic by design composting in a sealed container. I don't really like that because I don't like the generation of methane, for example. But there are ways you can deal with those. For me, I got dogs. I just feed my dogs my meat. I don't want rats in my compost pile. So keep it simple. Meats and fats out. And just make sure that it's nice and brown heavy. Make sure you're checking it. Turn it, you know, maybe once a week, once a month. If you can't turn it once a week, it's fine. If you can't turn it all summer, it's not ideal, but it'll still break down. It'll just make more methane. So try your best. Try to reduce the methane as much as you can. And happy composting. Grow that beautiful soil for your garden that's full of life, because the secret to gardening is life in the soil.